Hey y'all, so episode 3, this is crazy exciting to me. I want to share with you just a couple things for how to build your first Node.js application that's going to make an API request from DataForSEO. We're then going to receive that request, and it's going to be in the form of a JavaScript object that we're then going to turn into a piece of JSON. And we're going to write the output into a JSON file. And the thing that's cool about this is you're going to learn a whole lot about Node.js development in the process, and you're going to learn a lot about what's in the search results at the same time. Okay, so let's get rolling. The first thing we're going to do is open up our terminal, and we're going to do all kinds of things. We're going to go npm init. And what that's going to do is walk us through the process of building out a node package, which is important because we're going to be pulling in node packages that we use in order to build our scripts. And you're watching me just hit enter, 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 and in a moment what we're going to see is package.json. And to get started with Node, oftentimes I'll name my files index.js. I just find that that's an easy convention. Oftentimes I'll also use something called a .env file. These are crazy useful because they enable us to do things like storing usernames and passwords inside our variables. And you could just do it like this, equals username. You can also put it in double quotes if you want. And that would be your actual username for DataForSEO. So I'll just comment that, DataForSEO username. And then I'm also going to go password. Notice I'm using all caps. That's like a neat convention. Also, did you see how that whole thing auto-completed? That's because I've signed up for a program called GitHub Copilot. And what's neat about that is it oftentimes is going to save us all kinds of writing. Okay, so we've just defined our environmental variable file, and we call that .env. And you'll notice it's over here in our folder system. After this, we're going to switch back to our index.js file. Okay, and then let's talk through what else we're going to learn in this lesson. We're going to talk a little bit about a pattern in JavaScript called try-catch. We're also going to talk about APIs briefly. We're also going to talk about a pattern called async await, which is my favorite way of dealing with APIs, because when we request data from an API, the data comes back in an unknown amount of time. Sometimes it takes a second, sometimes it takes minutes, sometimes hours. And so we need a pattern for dealing with an asynchronous response. We're also going to talk about JSON, and we're specifically going to talk about something called stringify, which is how we take a response from an API and we turn it into a string of text. And that enables us to process it. And then we're going to run our function, i.e. go get data from an API. And then from there, we're going to write that response. And we're going to do this in a really simple way. We're going to write it into a file. And I'm going to teach you how to do that, which is pretty simple. That's what we're doing today. Okay, notice I'm doing this with comments, and comments are great with Node.js. You can do a single comment that's on one line. You can also do multi-line comments, and that pattern is cool. You do /**, and then as you do multi-line stuff, it just keeps extending that comment out for you. Both of these things are super useful. As you learn to code, you're going to want to comment every little thing that you build at first, so that when you come back in a year to something that you built, you'll actually have a clue what the heck is going on at each different section of the code. Okay, so let's get to work. We're going to require our .env package, and then we're also going to run a function called config, and we're next going to define another variable called fs, and that's part of the standard core Node library, and it stands for file system. So we got to require that. Open parentheses, single quote, fs, because we're saying that's the name of the package that we want to pull in. And then the next one that we're going to pull in is a package called Axios. And Axios is my favorite package for making HTTP requests. And you can post data with Axios, which is when you send data to something, which is how I typically am using it. But you can also do gets, and there's other HTTP methods that you can do with it. But the most common that you'll run into probably with your API work will be posting data, because you're basically sending a configuration of the data that you expect back in that response. Now that we've required our packages, let's get to work. We're going to define a constant, and we're going to call this keyword in. And the reason why is that we're going to be able to add keywords that we want to search for, and my favorite one is mountain bikes. I just love searching for mountain bikes. I've worked in the bike industry forever. It's just near and dear to my heart, so I almost always test things with mountain bikes. Notice I've capitalized some of these words, and let's make it messy. I'll have an uppercase N in there. I'll make my K uppercase, and you're like, what? But you'll get it in a minute, because we want to try and break things as we go so that we can make sure that our code is smart. And I'll show you what I mean here. I'm going to clean up my keyword in, and I'm going to account for the fact that sometimes people don't type awesome, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to put it into lowercase, and JavaScript offers a great method for that. We go to lowercase, and then we run that little function, and then now I will have cleaned up the fact that I have some of these are uppercase and some of them are lowercase. I want to deal with that. And then I'm also going to need a clean version of this. And what I mean by a clean version is I'm going to be saving the output into a file later. And so I want to get rid of all of my spaces in my search terms and put them as dashes instead, so that my file name will be really, really clean. So I'm going to call this keyword clean, and I'm going to define that as keyword and I'm going to replace my spaces with dashes. So I go keyword.replace, and I open that, and this accepts two parameters. The first is going to be the thing that we're searching for, and I'm going to say S like that, and G. We're doing some regex here. It's a little bit confusing, and you don't really have to know what's going on, but I'll explain it in just a second. Basically what we're doing is we're doing a regex match. We're looking for spaces, and we're capturing both a space and also if someone's using the space pattern, we're capturing both an empty space, like something where someone just hits the keyword, that's a space, and we're going to replace it, and you'll notice this G here, that means globally. So we're looking for this space, and that space when we do globally. If I didn't have that global, it would only replace the first space. So we want to use the G on the end. And now when I write my data into a file, what's going to happen is that that file name is going to have dashes, and it's all going to be lowercase. And you'll see this when we run the file. It's pretty fun. Next thing we need to define is our endpoint. The endpoint is where we're going to go get data from. And you'll notice that as I'm typing all this stuff, GitHub Copilot is doing a lot of the work for me, which is amazing, right? If you install this, it's in preview mode now. It'll save you an amazing amount of time. The way you use it is as you start to type, it'll then show in a grayed out format what it thinks you want to type, and to accept their recommendation, you just hit the tab key and it'll accept everything for you. This is our endpoint that we've been using with both lesson 1 and lesson 2 in the learning in public, so we're going to keep using that. When we're posting data to an endpoint, oftentimes we need to define the endpoint, and we also need to define the options. And those are the pieces of data that endpoint expect, and also that Axios expects in order to run a function. So we're going to define our options object. And you don't need to know a ton about what objects are, but basically objects are key value pairs. You can add all kinds of things inside them. Your key will be on the left. You'll then see a semicolon, and then on the right is the value. And values can be strings, which are like letters. They can be numbers. They can also be functions, can live inside objects. You don't need to know all that stuff. It's just really we need to define the method. And the method is the type of HTTP request that we're doing. And we're going to send a post. And then we need to define how we can authenticate with that API endpoint. And so we define the auth key or property, and inside of that we're going to place another object which is going to contain our username, which is what DataForSEO expects. And you remember how we created that .env file? Well, this is how to leverage .env file stuff that you store in there. So I've already defined, we'll say process.env, and then we use our all caps username because that's what we stored inside our .env file, right? It's all caps. I hit comma, and then I say password, process.env.password. Okay, and then from there, I need to make sure that I've closed off my auth value, which is an object, hit enter, and then next I need to send some data off to DataForSEO. And so I hit data, and then inside of that I'm going to add a different type of way of storing values in JavaScript, which is called an array. An array, because DataForSEO expects an array, and inside that array, the first item in the array is going to be an object. And so what we define inside that object, again, is our keyword, and we're going to get into some cool stuff here. So if I was to just send this weirdly cased thing off it's possible that DataForSEO could get confused. So we've already cleaned it up by turning it into lowercase. But what about the spaces? JavaScript gives us a really cool tool for managing all of this garbage, right? I already have it in lowercase, so I'm going to say keyword, and I'm going to encode it. And so I'll say encode URI. Notice that VS Code is giving me this really cool way of dealing with this. I can say encodeURIComponent, and then it needs to know what are we encoding. And in this case, we're going to encode our keyword, and then from there I hit my I hit my comma, go to my next line. DataForSEO expects us to define what language we're searching in. So we do language code, and then I need to add en, which is the language string. I also can add in my location code, and DataForSEO has a great CSV that I'll just share the link to with you here. But what this enables us to do is to define either the country, and 2480 refers to the United States. You can also search from a region or a state. You can also search from a county, and you can also search from a city. Okay, so scrolling down a little bit more, we're going to do some more neat work to make some progress here. So I've closed off, I'm going to close off here my data, and then the last thing that I need to send are my headers. And this is how Axios knows what type of content type I'm going to be receiving, right? So I'm going to define it as JSON, and I'll go content type space, and then I create a string, and that is application.json. And then watch what happens with this really neat thing that VS Code does. Let's say you're working away and you're like, hey, am I creating clean code? Well, watch what happens. If I hit Control S, it's going to, ooh, it didn't reformat it. I kind of expected it to reformat. I guess it's because it's on one line. Okay, so right now I've defined a bunch of interesting constants. I've defined my keyword in. I've cleaned it up a little bit. I've defined my endpoint, and I've also defined my object, which we're calling options. Okay, this is where we get to have fun, because this is where the work gets done. Because now we're going to define a function, and it's an asynchronous function. And you're going, whoa, what the heck is that? Well, an asynchronous function is what enables us to go get information from an API, and in this case it's DataForSEO, and to wait for that bit of information from that API. We have to do something. We need to do it in an asynchronous manner, and you'll see what I mean in a second. But whenever you're working with APIs, you go ask that API, and APIs, by the way, stand for Application Programming Interface. When you make an application, oftentimes you provide methods for yourself and others to get data out of that application, and we call those methods an application programming interface or an API, so that you can get data out of an application. Okay, so in this specific case, we're getting data, and while we're waiting for that data to respond, we need to have a way to get the rest of the application to wait for that data to come back to us before doing more stuff. And so The way we do it is we'll create what's called an asynchronous function, and what we're going to use inside of that asynchronous function is a pattern called async await, and I'll show you what I mean. So we're defining this as an asynchronous function by saying async function, and we're going to name it HTTP uppercase R, HTTP request, and then we're going to use a pattern called try catch. And the reason why I'm showing you this right off the bat, and you're probably feeling like you're being tossed into the deep end of the pool, is that with programming, there's something called the happy path, which is, well, at least I call it the happy path. And the happy path is what happens when everything goes right. Well, the problem is that when you program or build software or applications, that in general things are broken a lot, and so you need to handle errors all the time, because if you don't handle your errors, your applications will stop running. And the try catch pattern is awesome for that, because it allows us to try all of the things that happen properly, or the happy path is all happening inside of the try. And if things go wrong, we catch that error in the catch, and then we can do stuff with that error. And so we're going to create pretty much all of our pieces of functionality are going to happen inside the try. And if things break, we're going to see what has broken by logging it into our console. And so next thing that we're going to do is we're going to define a variable called const response. Response equals, and this is where the async await part comes in. And we're going to create an Axios request, and we're going to send or post that request off to our endpoint that we defined up here, or declared. And then we're also going to send in the body of our request is going to be this options object. So we go await Axios, and then inside Axios it accepts some parameters. So we're going to say typically they expect a string for that endpoint, or the URL where you're actually sending information. And so I've defined my endpoint as a string up here. And then the data that I'm sending, or the body that I'm sending, is this options object. So I can say options. And then, so then we're posting off to our endpoint. We wait, that's this await part. And then the data comes back and it gets saved into this variable called response. All of that's interesting, but really we want to see the data, right? So the way that we do that is we can do two things. First off, and we'll have some fun here, we'll go console.log response. And then for giggles, because I know what's going to happen, is I think it's actually going to be more useful for us if we console.log the response data. And that's going to show us some of our data, but it's not going to show everything. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. And we're going to type out another line which will comment out. We're going to say console.log JSON.stringify. Oh, I love this. This is so sweet. We go response.data, and then we close it off. And again, watch what VS Code does, because it's awesome. I hit Control S and it's going to clean this all up and remove extraneous lines, and my code looks beautiful. And then now to get this to actually run, I have to actually run the request, right? So I go request. Now watch what happens here. This is a neat thing with Node. Like let's say I define a function and I don't reference it anywhere else in the application, it'll become muted like this. And then the second that I run it or define that I'm going to run it somewhere else, you see how it gets bright? This is one of those ways where we can tell if we're kind of wasting code, right? So now, watch this. This is so cool. I'm going to make a request to this endpoint. So now I'm ready to run my application. And this is why VS Code is such a great tool to develop in, because you get to do stuff like this from the command line or from the terminal. I can do node, which means I want to run an application using Node. I'll say node index.js, and it points to my index.js file that's right inside my root directory. I hit enter, and then in about 10 seconds we're going to get a big long response from Axios, and it's going to look really messy and confusing. So it's first thing I see is status is 200. That's awesome. That means that we got a positive response. Status okay. Status text equals okay. Scroll down, and you're probably like, whoa, where's my data, dude? Where's all my data? Well, that's why we can't use the response directly. We have to instead use the response.data. And if I scroll down, you're going to see this. You'll see headers, config, request, and down here eventually we'll have I think we'll be able to see the data property. I forget if I can see it or not. Oh, there it is. Check it out. Data, and then inside all of the data that's coming back is inside this tasks object. Okay, so next time that we run it, we're going to hide the response, and instead I want to show you what happens when I log the response.data. It's going to log this object for us. And to clean out my terminal again, on a Mac I hold down Command K, and then from there I can hit the up arrow, and that's a great convenience because it'll pull in my node index.js again, hit enter. Whoops. This is awesome. And you're like, what's going on? Well, I forgot to save my .index.js file. Okay, so we just ran it once so that we were logging the response down in terminal, i.e. allowing us to look at it. I've updated the file so that I've changed what's commented so that now we're going to log the response.data, and it's going to show us just that part of the response, and it'll take about 10 seconds to go get the data, and what comes back is going to look different now. Check this out. So this is the data portion of the response, and what we can see is that our data is going to live mainly inside the tasks. In fact, all of it is going to be living inside the tasks. So next, check out what happens when I uncomment this bottom portion, which is let's log out just the response.data, but this time I'm going to take all this stuff that's stuck in arrays and I'm instead going to look at it as an object. I'm going to instead look at it as a piece of JSON, and to do that we have this cool this really neat way of dealing with it in JavaScript. So we type out uppercase JSON, which stands for I think it's JavaScript ordered notation, JSON, dot stringify. So we're taking our object and turning it into a string. I have to save my file to update it. I'm going to clear my terminal again, Command K, hit the up arrow, hit enter, and now it's going to look super different. It's going to look like a big wall of text to us, which is going to be the JavaScript. Now that I've returned the data and I get this huge wall of text, that's kind of annoying, right? So one of the ways that we can deal with that and make it more readable is we can type in JSON stringify accepts more parameters. I can say null here, which means I don't want to replace any values with anything. I hit comma and then I hit 2, and that's how much I want to indent things. I hit save, and then I hit my Command K again to clear out the terminal, hit the up arrow, hit enter, and then now when I go to log out my response, it's really easy for me to read. I can tell what's what. If I scroll to the top, I can I'll notice that the console sort of truncates or cuts off and only lets us inspect or look at the last chunk of stuff that's coming back. Okay, so we're almost done. We're making tons and tons of progress, right? So next, what we're going to do is we're going to write the output of our request, and we're going to write it using that file system package that we pulled in initially, and we're going to use write file sync, so that we're going to write the file in a synchronous method, which means that everything is going to wait for this particular function to run. And what I'm going to do is it expects 2 different parameters, which is where do we want to save it? You know, it's a where and a what, basically. So we have to define where we want to save the data, and then we have to define what do we want to save, right? So what do we want to do? We want to store it as a piece of JSON. So we're going to go, let's say where we want to save it first. And let's call it based on our keyword.clean. This is why we were cleaning everything up before, right? So we can say keyword, and then notice VS Code is giving me some cool stuff to use. I could say keyword clean, and then I can say plus, and then I have to add a little bit here, which is going to be .json. And then what are we going to put in there? We're going to put our data. So we're going to say JSON.stringify, and then we have to do the same thing pretty much that we were logging before. So we go response dot data, and watch what happens. I'm going to hit S to save it. I'm going to clear my terminal, Command K, up arrow, run it, and then what we're going to notice is a new file that's going to appear up here. Boom. Mountain bike for sale.json. And then if I open it up, I get my wall of text, which is kind of a bummer. But VS Code has a really cool convenience, which is if I click anywhere inside that file and hit Command S or Control S on a PC, it then cleans it up really nicely to make it really easy to read. And so now, what have we done? We have done the same thing that we did in Postman, except now we can save our response into a file. Woohoo! This is super exciting. Now, you might be thinking, yeah, it's kind of cool, but is this all really useful? Well, we could make it a little bit cleaner by adding like a new folder, and we could save all of our JSON files there, and we could put it into the output folder. That's one way of dealing with this. Another way would be to save all of this data up into a database, and I'll show you how to do that in a future lesson. But let's see how to save everything into this output folder instead. So, and at the same time, I'm going to show you a really neat little pattern here. So we're going to go backticks, and you're like, whoa, backticks, what? Well, backticks are really cool because they enable me to use something called a template literal, which is a really, really cool way of taking our code to the next level. So I'm going to go period, and I'm going to type in /output because I'm in the root folder right now, and I need to actually save my data into the output folder instead, right? Because I want to keep my working directory clean. And I'm going to put my file there, and this is where we get into the template literal part. I do $, open parenthesis, open squirrely brackets, and then I do squirrely brackets after that. And then what I'm going to do is get rid of all of these two things. And now I have a little bit easier to read code. And I go Control S to save it. Again, I'm going to hit Command K to clean out my terminal, hit up arrow, run it again, and then this time my file is going to be saved inside my output folder. That way I can keep all of my responses in one place, which is going to be that output folder. How cool is that? So, thank you for another episode of Learning in Public. This has been super fun. Just to remind you guys what we did, we made a request, we received it, and we were able to save it into a JSON file. And we even stored it in its own folder over here in the output folder. This was super exciting. In a future episode, I'm going to teach you how to save it up into Google BigQuery. And I'm also going to teach you how to save the data into a tool called Firestore, which I think is more fun and a little bit easier to learn how to use. So I want to show you how to process this response and save it up into Firestore. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Talk soon. Bye.